I'm happy to welcome back Professor Mauro Guillen, and he's a management professor here at Wharton. And he's also a native of Spain, which makes it especially appropriate because we want to talk about the recent elections in Catalonia, which many saw as a kind of proxy for an independence movement. There was a court decision in Spain last year which prevented a legal vote on independence, as I understand it, for Catalonia. Nevertheless, these regional elections, which have just taken place, were viewed by many as a sort of plebiscite or a proxy of that, and could have had some or could still have some serious ramifications. So I wanted to ask, some thought there was going to be a clean outcome. It didn't come out so clean or so clear. So could you put it in context and tell us, it was a little bit messy, and it's going to make the politics messy going forward.
Yeah, I think messy is the word, although, as you know, democracies are always messy, right? But I think the outcome of this particular election is especially messy, and of course, this is only 3 days after the election has taken place, so, one also has to be careful about over-interpreting the results because we don't know exactly what kinds of conversations and coalition-building efforts are being made by the various parties, right, depending on their seats in parliament. I also want to clarify one important thing, which is that I was born in Spain, but outside of Catalonia, although my father was from Catalonia. So I don't claim, though, to represent both sides of the issue. And, I think in Spain, in Catalonia, everywhere in the world, there's always differences of opinion and there's a diversity of views, right? But, yeah, the outcome is messy because, on the one hand, what you have is that the parties that that propose a independence for Catalonia won a majority of the seats. But there are two parties there. There were two lists competing for seats, and they don't entirely agree as to what the process should be moving forward, right? That's one of the problems here. The other is that although they got a majority of the votes, of the seats, they only got about 48% of the votes. And the reason for that is that the electoral law is such that the rural areas in Catalonia have an overrepresentation in parliament relative to their population, whereas the greater metropolitan area in Barcelona, which includes many industrial towns around it, is underrepresented in terms of its population weight. But the nationalists, the independent movement, is stronger in the rural areas, in the smaller cities, than it is in Barcelona itself. So the result is very messy, and I think it is fair to say that the last couple of years have, resulted in a situation in which Catalan society is deeply divided, evenly split, right, apparently between these two options.
There's a lot of issues connected with this, if there were an independent Catalonia. I mean, there's the membership in the EU. This is assuming that Catalonia left, which isn't, we're not assuming that, but if it did leave. The membership in the EU, using the euro, membership in NATO, all of these things. There's also a big issue about debt that Catalonia owns, owes, I should say, but that's also tied in legally with Spain and Spain's overall debt. Could you talk about some of those issues?
Well, if any part of an existing country were to become independent, there's a number of very difficult issues that need to be addressed. One is there is debt, as you said, that may be attributed to the region, but a debt that is actually right now debt of the entire country, right? But there's also resources, right? So those conversations, those negotiations, in any case, not just in this case, would be extremely difficult, right? Because there are assets and there are liabilities. And if there's a divorce, you need to come up with some arrangement as to how you are dividing up not only the assets, right, but also the liabilities. The issue of European Union membership and the issue of NATO memberships, I think those two are separate. But I don't think they are as severe in this case as there would be in the Scottish case. Because in the case of Scotland, what one has to remember is that most of the population in Scotland, right, is pro-European Union, right, as it is in Spain and in Catalonia. But if you go to England, most of the population, right, a majority of the population is probably against membership in the European Union. And as you know, Prime Minister David Cameron has promised a referendum in the UK about EU membership, right? So that's one very big difference. That is to say that If Scotland were to, become independent in the UK, right, from the UK, then probably England and Wales would leave the European Union because most people want to leave, right? But Scotland, would become a member, right? How quickly? It depends on how fast Scotland would be able to replicate the kinds of institutions that Europe expects you to have, like a central bank, like all of the institutions of the state, right? In the case of Catalonia, both people living in Catalonia and people in the rest of Spain want to be part of the European Union. So the issue there is, would Catalonia be ready, right? That would be the issue. And the other issue, of course, is whether any existing member country would veto, right, Catalonia's membership, because Catalonia would need to apply. And people are saying, well, Spain might veto it, or somebody else might veto Catalonia. And that's obviously a distinct possibility. But what I think is very clear, and this is not just an opinion of mine, it's based on analysis, right? But of course, there are other analyses that come to the opposite conclusion, is that I think a separation of Catalonia from Spain would be, at least in the short run, right, very harmful to both Spain and Catalonia, right? And I say this because obviously there is a very long shared history, right? But more importantly, because it is still a fact that has been demonstrated by this election 4 days ago, that the support for independence in Catalonia is at best half of the country, right? It's half of the population. So it's very difficult to set into motion a process of separation, a process of independence, when you have 50% of the people living in that part of the country opposed to it. The rifts, the conflicts, the frictions that this would create, I think would be so severe that I think most reasonable people would think twice about the benefits from that separation.
And this is within Catalonia itself.
Absolutely. Catalonia, the elections have demonstrated, is divided. Now, I would like to add another thing which is very important. I think both the central government in Madrid and the Catalonian government, with their actions, have polarized public opinion and have polarized the voters, as if there were only two choices, right? The two choices being things remain the same or Catalonia becomes independent. And there is very good survey research indicating that if you offer Catalonians, people who live in Catalonia, a third choice, somewhere in between, which is, for example, to renegotiate the way in which Catalonia relates to the rest of Spain, or perhaps to create more of a federal system in Spain. So Spain is not a federal country, right, like the United States or like Germany. Then if you offer that third intermediate choice, then suddenly what you get is maybe 20% of people want independence, 20% want the status quo, but you have a large majority, like 60% of the population, who would rather take the third intermediate option.
So this is really interesting because I did want to get to the fundamental issue, which is what is the big beef for those that want to become independent? What is their chief complaint? It has something to do with feeling that their region produces more tax per capita, I guess, than other regions, so that they're giving the federal system more than they're getting back. There's also, I guess, some historical reasons about how Catalonia became part of Spain to begin with, which wasn't even all that long ago, as I understand it. And there are some other things. So I did want to ask you, what are the chief complaints for those that want to break away? And then also maybe compare, as you did with Scotland, how the Catalonian system may be similar or different from, say, Quebec, or maybe there's other aspects between the relationship of Scotland and England that you'd want to touch on also.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, I mean, one has to be very respectful about, people's identities. And I think everybody has to respect that, some people may feel more Catalan than Spanish, or they may feel only Catalan, right? Or they may feel Spanish, but they also think that they have a connection to Catalonia, right? So there's all sorts of identities and shared identities or dual identities that people have, and I personally want to be really respectful to all of them, including the people who feel that Catalonia should be an independent country and they feel only Catalan. The reality, though, is that those people are in the minority, right? That is the reality. That is the fact that I think this election corroborates. Now, having said that, right, There are also other more, rational issues at play, because identity is, at the end of the day, is an emotional issue, but it should be respected, right? That's really important. There's the money issue, as you said. So Catalonia is one of the 3 richest parts of Spain, along with Madrid and the Balearic Islands, which are on the Mediterranean. Well, in every country in the world, the parts of the country that are richer make a bigger contribution to the budget, right? Just because they're richer. That happens in the United States. California makes a bigger contribution than Alabama, right, to the federal budget, in the sense that they get back, right, in services less than what they contribute in the form of taxes. This happens everywhere, right? So the situation of Catalonia within Spain is different than the situation of Scotland in the UK, because in Scotland, because of the decline of manufacturing industry, is not as rich as some other parts of England, especially the London metropolitan area, right? And that's also the case in Canada with Quebec. So the Catalonian case is different, right? So absolutely. I mean, Catalonia is contributing more to the central budget, but that's not necessarily because it is being discriminated against. A lot of that, I'm not saying that all of it, but a lot of that is driven by the fact that they're richer, right? And therefore, in any political system, in any arrangement, right, that you can find, you will always see that richer regions contribute more, proportionally speaking, than the amount of services or the value of the services that they get from the central budget, right? So I think that's important to clarify, right? And having said that, once again, there are people who believe that Catalonia should be independent. I think they are more driven by their identity and their sense of identity as opposed to by the numbers, right? Although the numbers, as they exist today, exacerbate that feeling, right? That feeling of, oh, we're contributing a lot. But you see, an independent Catalonia in the context of Europe, right, will also be richer than the average country in Europe. So they would also make a net contribution to the rest of Europe, right? And as you know, Europe has very aggressive programs in place to help relatively backward parts of Europe cope with that backwardness, and they get more money for investments in infrastructure and so on and so forth. So Catalonia will always be, because it's rich, it's a successful country, right? It will always be a net contributor, right? Even if it became an independent state within Europe.
2 last questions. What do you think is most likely to happen, realizing you gave the qualifier up front that we're just after the election and the dust is settling, so to speak? And also, is there a risk, or I should say, how big is the risk that over this debt issue, it's a fairly substantial debt, as I understand it, and if there was some breakdown between Spain and Catalonia, could that possibly lead to a financial crisis that would affect the rest of Europe?
Well, I think, once again, even if there's no independence of Catalonia, just the messy political environment in which, the relationship between Catalonia and the rest of Spain, or the central government, is in now, I think is something that doesn't create the right conditions for investment and for job creation, right? The Spanish economy, including Catalonia, is actually doing quite well. It is one of the fastest growing economies in Europe right now, growing at slightly more than 3%, right? Which is not bad given the circumstances. So this uncertainty is going to be detrimental to economic growth and job creation. But the other big thing that is coming up is in December, we have national elections in Spain. So quite frankly, I think the answer to your question as to what's going to happen next in Catalonia is that pretty much everything, is going to, wait until, the December election, which is 2.5 months away, right? And depending on the outcome of that election, then we will see what's going to happen with essentially this impasse that we have in Catalonia, this situation in which you have one half of Catalonia being in favor of independence, apparently, right, given the election results, and another half being opposed to it. Although remember that I said that if you give them a third option, the situation would change, right? But essentially there's 2 possibilities here. One is that the new government emerging in Madrid will be similar to the one that we have now, which, as I told you earlier, has been trying to polarize the issue as if there were only 2 options, right? Or there's another possibility, which is that a different kind of government emerges, and is one that is willing to propose a third intermediate option, right? And so depending on the outcome of the national election, in which actually Catalonians will also get to vote, then we will see, things evolving in Catalonia itself, beginning in January, down the path of more conflict and more friction, and I think a continuing, gridlock, right, because essentially the two opposing views are very balanced, right? Or, as an alternative, there will be down a path of maybe a constitutional reform, maybe very extensive negotiations as to a redefinition of how not just Catalonia, but possibly also other parts of Spain relate to the central government. And there is a lot of discussion, for example, about taking some steps towards a federal system.
All right, well, we'll have to wait and see if it's a happier new year there in Spain and Catalonia. Thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you for having me.